we're back and ready to move on to chapter 3. But before we get to chapter 3, I want to recap really quick what happened in chapter 2. So we know in chapter 1, Jonas was feeling apprehensive about this ceremony that's coming up. And we find out what the ceremonies are. So every December, they have a ceremony, like a ritual, and every year, like everyone turns one at the same time, and things happen to them, right? So at the ceremony of one, there's always 50 babies. They get their family, they get their name, and we find out that Jonas's dad, whose job it is to take care of the babies before they get to their family unit, he's been so worried about this little guy that they have, and he looked up his name. And Jonas is just shocked that his father has broken a rule. He looks at his mom, who's like a judge, and he's like, is he going to get in trouble for that? And we think about that compared to our world, like just how many rules that they have. And we have rules too, and we have laws. But you know that in our world, people break the rules, right? So if you're sitting in a classroom, you might see kids chewing gum when they're not supposed to, or talking when they're not supposed to. We get very unfazed by people breaking some rules, right? But in their community, it does not happen. So lots of times when we're reading this book, I know kids are always like, well, why doesn't he just do this? For example, like with the telling of the feelings. I know that I'm a sharer, so I don't mind sharing my feelings, but maybe some of us at home, that would make you feel awkward or uncomfortable if you have to go around your family and share your feelings for the day, and you'd be like, well, I just wouldn't do it, I would lie. But they don't do that. They can't do that because that would be breaking the rules, and they do not break the rules. They don't do it. So dad looks up this little guy's name, and his name is Gabriel, but he calls him Gabe. So that was the first big thing that happened. And then we find out that, the bicycles. So that's a rule that they do break very frequently. So they get their bikes when they're 9 years old. But lots of times the older siblings will teach the younger ones to ride the bike so they can speed off after the ceremony of 9. And that's really similar to like our world. If you don't get your driver's license until you're 16, but when you're 15, you will start driver's ed, and your parent or your adult or someone at school is going to teach you how to drive. So when you're 16, you can get in that car and speed off. And Jonas has been so apprehensive and nervous about his upcoming ceremony of 12 because that's when they get their assignment. And their assignments are also like their jobs. So when I look out at you guys in 7th grade, many of us are 12, just turning 13. Can you imagine getting a job that you are going to have for the rest of your life at 12 years old? So when I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a fashion designer, which it makes me laugh because I am the least fashionable person I know. But sometimes when we're 12, what we want to be when we're 12 is not the same thing we want to be when we're 15 or 18 when we are adults. So I even switched my major in college. So when I went to college, I wanted to be a special education teacher. And then after a year, I was like, actually, I really love to read and I want to be an English teacher. So we change our minds a lot, and that's okay. But at 12 years old, the elders decide a job for each of these kids. And Jonas is so worried because he doesn't know what he wants to be. They do volunteer hours, and they like watch what the kids are good at and what they're interested in, and that's how they pick their job. But Jonas, he doesn't really know what he wants to be, so he's feeling really nervous, and he's worried about his friend Asher, who's so much fun, but he's like, I can't see him having like a real job. And his parents are like, listen, like it all works out, everyone gets the job that they love, and everything's going to be fine. Okay, so we are ready to move on to chapter 3. Oh, and Lily's back. I love Lily. Oh, look, Lily squealed in delight. Isn't he cute? Look how tiny he is. And he has funny eyes like yours, Jonas. Jonas glared at her. He didn't like it that she had mentioned his eyes. He waited for his father to chastise Lily, but father was busy unstrapping the carrying basket from the back of his bicycle. Jonas walked over to look. Okay, pause. I want to go back to this word chastise here. Let's take a look at that vocab. He waited for his father to chastise Lily. So Lily says, oh, he has funny eyes like yours. And Jonas glares at her. So what do you think the word chastise means? Good. Chastise means like to yell at, okay? So dad wouldn't like punish Lily severely. If you get chastised, it might just be like your parents being like, knock it off. That would be being chastised. It was the first thing Jonas noticed as he looked at the new child peering up curiously from the basket, the pale eyes. Almost every citizen in the community had dark eyes. His parents did, and Lily did, and so did all of his group members and friends. But there were a few exceptions. Jonas himself and a female 5 who he had noticed had the different, lighter eyes. Well, no one mentioned such things. It wasn't a rule, but it was considered rude to call attention to things that were unsettling or different about individuals. Lily, he decided, would have to learn that soon, or she would be called in for chastisement because of her insensitive chatter. All right, what do we find out right here about the community? Almost every citizen in the community has, good, they almost all have dark eyes. But Jonas, and there's a female 5, and now this baby all have light eyes. And they wouldn't say, like, you wouldn't call someone out and be like, oh, I see you have green eyes. That would be rude because you don't want to like call attention to individuals. So he's like, Lily better knock that off or she's going to get in trouble. Father put his bike into its port, and then he picked up the basket and carried it into the house. Lily followed behind, but she glanced back over her shoulder at Jonas and teased, maybe he had the same birth mother as you. Jonas shrugged. He followed them inside, but he had been startled by the new child's eyes. Mirrors were rare in the community. They weren't forbidden, but there was no real need of them, and Jonas had simply never bothered to look at himself very often, even when he found himself in a location where a mirror existed. Now, seeing the new child and its expression, he was reminded that the light eyes were not only a rarity, but he gave them one that had them a certain look. What was it? Depth, he decided, as if one were looking into the clear water of the river, down to the bottom where things might lurk which hadn't been discovered yet. He felt self-conscious, too, realizing that he, too, had that look. He went to his desk, pretending not to be interested in the new child. On the other side of the room, Mother and Lily were bending over to watch as Father unwrapped his blanket. What's his comfort object called? Lily asked, picking up the stuffed creature which had been placed beside the new child in his basket. Father glanced at it. Hippo, he said. Lily giggled at the strange word. Hippo, she repeated, and put the comfort object down again. She peered at the unwrapped new child, who waved his arms. Oh, I think new children are so cute, Lily sighed. I hope I get assigned to be a birth mother. Lily, Mother spoke very sharply. Don't say that. There's very little honor in that assignment. But I was talking to Natasha, the 10 who lives around the corner, and she does some of her volunteer hours at the birthing center. And she told me that birth mothers get wonderful food and they have very gentle exercise periods. And most of the time they just play games and they amuse themselves while they're waiting. I think I'd like that, Lily said petulantly. 3 years, Mother told her firmly. 3 births, and that's all. After that, they are laborers for the rest of their adult lives until the day that they enter the house of the old. Is that what you want, Lily? 3 lazy years and then hard physical labor until you're old? Well, no, I guess not, Lily acknowledged reluctantly. Father turned the new child onto his tummy in the basket. He sat beside it and rubbed its small back with a rhythmic motion. Anyway, Lily Billy, he said affectionately, the birth mothers never even get to see new children. If you enjoy the little ones so much, you should hope for an assignment as nurturer. When you're an 8 and you start your volunteer hours, you can try some at the nurturing center. Yes, I think I will, Lily said, and she knelt beside the basket. What did you say his name is? Gabriel? Hello, Gabriel, she said in a sing-song voice, and then she giggled. Oops, she whispered. I think he's asleep. I guess I'd better be quiet. All right, what do we find out about birth mothers here? You're right. Okay, the birth mothers are birth mothers for 3 years. They give birth 3 times, and then they become laborers, so they do like manual work for the rest of their lives. All right, let's keep reading. Jonas turned to his school assignments on his desk. Some chance of that, he thought. Lily was never quiet. Probably she should hope for an assignment as speaker so that she could sit in the office with the microphone all day making announcements. He laughed silently to himself, picturing his sister droning on in the self-important voice that all the speakers seemed to develop, saying things like, "Attention. This is a reminder to females under 9 that hair ribbons are to be neatly tied at all times." He turned towards Lily and noticed to his satisfaction that her ribbons were, as usual, undone and dangling. There would be an announcement like that quite soon, he felt certain, and it would be directed mainly at Lily, although her name, of course, would not be mentioned. Everyone would know. Everyone had known, he remembered with humiliation, that the announcement, "Attention, this is a reminder to male 11s that objects are not to be removed from the recreation area, and that snacks are to be eaten, not hoarded," had been specifically directed at him the day last month that he had taken an apple home. No one had mentioned it, not even his parents, because the public announcement had been sufficient to produce the appropriate remorse. He had, of course, disposed of the apple and made his apology to the recreation director the next morning before school. Okay, pause. Jonas broke a rule, and he didn't really get in trouble, but they made an announcement over the loudspeaker. So what did Jonas do to break a rule? Good. Jonas took an apple from the recreation area and he brought it home. And that is not supposed to happen. If you take an apple there, you're supposed to eat it there, and you don't hoard your snacks. So an announcement came on over the loudspeaker, and it just was a reminder to everyone, and he got rid of the apple and he apologized the next day. Okay, but now you're going to find out why he took that apple, so pay attention. Jonas thought again about that incident. He was still bewildered by it. Not by the announcement or the necessary apology. Those were standard procedures, and he had deserved them. But by the incident itself. He probably should have brought up his feelings of bewilderment that very evening when the family unit had shared their feelings of the day. But he had not been able to sort out and put words to the source of his confusion, so he had let it pass. It had happened during the recreation period when he had been playing with Asher. Jonas had casually picked up an apple from the basket where the snacks were kept and had thrown it to his friend. Asher had thrown it back, and they had begun a simple game of catch. There had been nothing special about it. It was an activity that he had performed countless times. Throw, catch, throw, catch. It was effortless for Jonas and even boring, although Asher enjoyed it. And playing catch was a required activity for Asher because it would improve his hand-eye coordination, which was not up to standards. But suddenly, Jonas had noticed, following the path of the apple through the air with his eyes, that the piece of fruit had, well, this was the part that he couldn't adequately understand. The apple had changed, just for an instant. It had changed in midair, he remembered. Then it was in his hand, and he looked at it carefully, but it was the same apple, unchanged, the same size and shape, a perfect sphere, the same nondescript shade, about the same shade as his own tunic. There was absolutely nothing remarkable about that apple. He had tossed it back and forth between his hands a few times, and then thrown it again to Asher, and again in the air. For an instant only, it had changed. It had happened 4 times. Jonas had blinked, looked around, and then tested his eyesight, squinting at the small print on the identification badge attached to his tunic. He read his name quite clearly. He could also clearly see Asher at the other end of the throwing area, and he had had no problem catching the apple. Jonas had been completely mystified. "Ash," he had called, "does anything seem strange to you about the apple?" "Yes," Asher called back, laughing. "It jumps out of my hand onto the ground." Asher had just dropped it once again. So Jonas laughed too, and with his laughter tried to ignore his uneasy conviction that something had happened. But he had taken the apple home against the recreation area rules. That evening, before his parents and Lily arrived at the dwelling, he had held it in his hands and he looked at it carefully. It was slightly bruised now because Asher had dropped it several times, but there was nothing at all unusual about the apple. He had held a magnifying glass to it. He had tossed it several times across the room, watching, and then rolling it around and around on his desktop, waiting for the thing to happen again. But it hadn't. The only thing that happened was the announcement later that evening over the speaker. The announcement that had singled him out without using his name, that had caused both of his parents to glance meaningfully at his desk where the apple still lay. Okay, stop. What? Why did Jonas take this apple? You're right. When he was playing catch with Asher, something happened to the apple. It like changed in midair and he can't figure it out. Asher doesn't notice it. He takes it home. He's looking at it with magnifying glass. Doesn't happen again. And then the speaker tells him, that he shouldn't take the apple. So he has no idea what that was about. That was weird. All right. Now, sitting at his desk, staring at his schoolwork as his family hovered over the new child in its basket, he shook his head, trying to forget the odd incident. He forced himself to arrange his papers and try to study a little before the evening meal. The new child, Gabriel, stirred and whimpered, and father spoke softly to Lily, explaining the feeding procedure as he opened the container that held the formula and equipment. The evening proceeded as all evenings did in the family unit, in the dwelling, and in the community. Quiet, reflective, a time for renewal and preparation for the day to come. It was different only in the addition to it of the new child with his pale, solemn, knowing eyes. All right, that's the end of chapter 3. Are you wondering what's going on? Remember how I said, unless you get done with this, if you don't have 5 questions, you're doing it wrong. All right, last question that I have for you is, what does Jonas and Gabriel have in common? Good. They both have those pale eyes. Something to think about, friends. All right, tomorrow we will do chapter 4. Have a good day.